After years in the classroom, I thought I had seen it all. Until one unforgettable moment with a student left me speechless. The situation was so unbelievable that I walked out that same day and never came back, retiring on the spot. This isn't just a story about a stroke. It's about betrayal in its purest form, about being abandoned to die by the very people I was there to protect. I was literally dying, gasping for air, while a classroom full of teenagers, my students, laughed, mocked, and recorded my collapse. They thought it was a performance, a prank, but for me it was 12 minutes to permanent brain damage or death, and they were savoring every second. I was in the middle of teaching history, just a normal Tuesday, when the world started to tilt. Not just dizzy, but a violent, sickening spin. My heart slammed. I knew with a terrifying certainty exactly what was happening. This wasn't a dizzy spell. It was a stroke. Again. I'd been 2 months clear, 2 months of breathing easy, but now it was back, and it was taking hold fast. I needed 911. My voice came out slurred, thick. Call 911. My hand fumbled for the desk phone, my lifeline. But then Derek, one of the cool kids, jumped up. Before I could even protest, he yanked the phone cord right out of the wall. No phones during class, he sneered, a smirk playing on his lips. Your rule, remember? I had 12 minutes. 12 minutes before my brain would be irrevocably damaged. Or worse. My left arm, suddenly alien, hung uselessly at my side, a dead weight as I tried desperately to move it. Please, I choked out. A stroke. But my mouth wouldn't cooperate, just a garbled mess. Then Sarah, a real drama queen, let out this fake gasp. Oh no, his arm. She shot up, letting her own arm go completely limp, swinging it around like a grotesque rag doll. Look at me. I'm Mr. R. The class erupted. A roar of laughter filled the room, deafening. Derek high-fived her. Yo, that's perfect. Everyone started performing now, trying to outdo each other for the biggest laugh. Derek, along with 2 other boys, blocked the door. Not because they thought I was faking, but because it fed their ego. It got them more laughs. Nobody leaves during Mr. R's performance. Jake started a slow clap. Bravo! Bravo! Others joined in. The applause grew, a chilling sound in my ears. They were all looking at each other, feeding off the sick energy. Nobody wanted to be the lame one who ruined the fun. 9 minutes left. My left eye went completely dark. I tried to stand, but my left leg buckled, sending me crashing into the desk. He's doing his own stunts, someone shouted. Tom Cruise could never. The laughter was deafening now, each joke earning the speaker more status, more attention. Gail, who always sat in front, looked worried. Guys, half his face is drooping. But Derek immediately shut her down. Don't be such a mom, Gail. She shrank back. Nobody else dared to show concern. I reached for my wallet, for the emergency contact card listing my medical conditions. My good hand was shaking so badly I dropped it. Cards scattered everywhere. He's throwing his credit cards. Mike laughed, making it rain. Someone snatched my medical alert card before I could grab it. Ooh, what's this? His Actors Guild membership. Vomit rose in my throat. I couldn't stop it. It sprayed across my desk, chunks of my lunch mixed with bile. The class shrieked and jumped back. Yo, he actually threw up. That's so extra. Tyler zoomed in with his phone. Wait till TikTok sees this. Mike pretended to gag. I'm gonna throw up too. Look, I'm catching his fake disease. More laughs. 6 minutes left. The room started spinning violently. Not just dizziness, but like being trapped inside a tornado. I grabbed the edge of a student's desk to steady myself. Get off me, she shrieked, yanking her desk away. 5 minutes left. My tongue felt like it was swelling, filling my mouth. I tried to yell for help, but all that came out was a weird groan. Ah! The class exploded. Walker alert. Walking Dead Season 12. My good eye caught the fire alarm. Derek saw where I was looking. Betty won't pull it, he announced loudly, referring to me by my nickname. Betty's too scared to get in trouble. It was a challenge now, so I did what I had to do. I hit the floor hard, and with everything in me I started crawling. Each movement was agony. Zombie teacher. Kids started zombie walking around the room, dragging their legs. Each person trying to make their impression funnier. Brains must teach history. The whole class was in on it now. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought my chest would explode. 2 minutes left. Everything was going dark around the edges. Drool poured from the left side of my mouth in a steady stream. Sarah pretended to slip in it. Help! I'm drowning in teacher drool. Eric had to reclaim his throne as the funniest. He stepped on my good hand as I crawled. This has gone too far, Mr. R. Just admit you're pranking us. 1 minute left. With the last bit of strength, I grabbed Tyler's ankle and yanked. He fell backwards. Kids screamed with laughter. Zombie teacher got Tyler. He's infected now. I pulled myself over his legs, reached up. My finger found the fire alarm. The scream of the alarm cut through everything. Suddenly it wasn't funny anymore. Doors flew open. Mrs. Mayu from next door took one look and screamed, "Stroke! He's having a stroke. Call 911 now." The laughter died instantly. Everyone's phones lowered. The fire chief later told us that if I hadn't pulled that alarm when I did, I would have been dead in under a minute. The clot in my brain was massive. Those 45 seconds were literally the difference between me typing this story and my wife planning my funeral. Eric and 6 others were banned from any public school in the district. The ones who blocked the door and took my phone faced criminal charges. But that wasn't enough for me. They practically tried to kill me for laughs. So I was ready to return the favor. The first thing I remember after pulling that fire alarm was beeping. Constant beeping from machines all around me. My eyes wouldn't open right, like someone had glued them shut. I forced the right one open and saw tubes coming out of everywhere. My arms looking like a science experiment with IVs and monitors attached. My wife was sitting in a plastic chair next to the bed, her face all red and puffy from crying. She grabbed my hand when she saw me looking at her and started crying harder. A nurse rushed in and checked all the machines while my wife kept saying the fire chief's exact words over and over. I'd been 45 seconds from death when they got to me. 45 seconds. The nurse called for Dr. Leo Curry, who showed up within minutes carrying a tablet with my brain scans on it. He pointed at this huge white blob on the screen that looked like someone had spilled milk inside my head. That was the clot that almost killed me. He explained how the 12-minute window I'd been counting in my head was actually real, that I'd made it to the hospital with maybe 30 seconds to spare before permanent damage would have been total. The surgery had taken 6 hours to clear the blockage and repair the damage. That first night in the ICU was the worst. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that classroom. Sarah's arm swinging around like a dead fish while she laughed. Derek's foot pressing down on my hand while I tried to crawl. The way they all kept performing for each other while I was dying. The humiliation felt worse than the physical pain from the surgery, worse than the headache that wouldn't stop. I kept seeing their faces, hearing their laughter, feeling that crushing weight of being entertainment while my brain was shutting down. Principal Ralph Doy showed up on day 2 wearing his usual suit and a fake concerned face. He sat in the visitor chair for maybe 2 minutes asking how I felt before launching into what he really came for. He kept using phrases like controlling the narrative and managing district exposure, while barely looking at me. He wanted to know what I planned to tell the media, whether I'd hired a lawyer yet, how we could work together to minimize damage. He never once asked about my actual recovery or what those kids had done to me. Christopher Owens from the teachers union arrived right after Ralph left, like they'd coordinated their visits. Christopher was different, though actually angry about what happened. He pulled out a notebook and told me to document everything I could remember, every single detail, but to stay completely silent publicly. Any Facebook post, any interview, any comment could give the kids' lawyers ammunition to paint me as vindictive or unstable. He said the union would back me, but I had to play this smart. On day 3, the hospital phone rang, and it was Assistant DA Isla Henderson. She explained in this calm, professional voice how the juvenile justice process would work for Derek and the others. The door blocking and phone destruction were serious charges, she said. But juvenile court had major limits on consequences. She kept managing my expectations, warning me that these kids probably wouldn't see jail time, even though they'd almost killed me. The parents had already hired expensive lawyers who were building a defense about misunderstanding the situation and teenage judgment errors. By the end of week 1, I was finally able to sit up and use my phone. That's when I found out someone had leaked the classroom security footage online. The video was everywhere, showing me crawling across the floor while kids mocked me, and Derek stepped on my hand. The comment section was split between people calling for the kids to be arrested and others saying I was exaggerating for attention, that it couldn't have been that serious if I survived. Reading those comments saying I was faking or overreacting made my chest tighten until I couldn't breathe. The room started spinning again, but different this time, not from a stroke but from pure panic. I pressed the call button over and over while gasping for air. The nurses found me hyperventilating so bad, they had to give me medication to calm down. The doctor on duty recommended immediate therapy to process what she called trauma response from the incident. That's how I ended up in my first session with Zora Hampton, the hospital therapist. Still wearing a hospital gown with bandages on my head, I sat there for 10 minutes before finally admitting what I really felt. I wanted to hurt those kids the way they'd almost killed me. I wanted them to know what it felt like to be helpless while people laughed. Zora didn't judge or lecture me about forgiveness. She just asked me to explore what returning the favor actually meant to me, what I thought it would accomplish. The session ended with her scheduling me for twice-weekly appointments. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with an email from the district. The subject line just said, "Disciplinary actions confidential." I opened it and read the formal notice 3 times, each time hoping it would say more. Derek and 6 others were officially banned from all district schools pending criminal proceedings. The email made it sound like some huge consequence, but I kept thinking about those 45 seconds about how they'd laughed while my brain was dying. This barely scratched the surface of what they deserved. The next morning, Dr. Curry came into my room carrying a thick folder and pulled a chair close to my bed. He spread out charts showing my brain scans, pointing to the dark spots where the clot had done its damage. Then he laid out what my life would look like from now on. Blood pressure checks every 4 hours, medication at exact times down to the minute, no caffeine, no salt, strict sleep schedule, and absolutely no stress because any spike in my blood pressure could trigger another stroke that would probably kill me this time. He handed me a logbook where I'd have to record everything: my meals, my sleep, my mood, my blood pressure readings, like I was some kind of science experiment. The restrictions felt worse than the physical therapy exercises he was prescribing. At least those would eventually end. But this monitoring would be forever. Christopher showed up in week 3 with his briefcase full of forms and sat at my bedside table helping me write out the formal incident report for the union. He knew exactly which words to use, making sure we documented how Derek yanked the phone cord from the wall, how 3 boys physically blocked the door, how they destroyed my only way to call for help while I was dying. He typed while I talked, stopping me whenever I got too emotional to rephrase things in legal language that would hold up in court. We spent 4 hours getting every detail right, Christopher asking questions about exact times and who stood where and what each kid said, building the case piece by piece. That same week, I started writing my victim impact statement on the hospital laptop, and the first version was just pure rage pouring onto the screen. I wrote about wanting them to suffer, wanting them to know what it felt like to be helpless while people laughed at your death, wanting their futures destroyed the way they almost destroyed mine. I saved it, then deleted the whole thing and started over, trying to sound more controlled, even though the anger kept bleeding through every sentence. I must have written 20 versions, each one trying to find the balance between showing the trauma they caused and not sounding so vengeful that a judge would dismiss me. Isla called again to explain the charges, and this time she had specifics about who faced what. Derek was looking at the most serious charges for blocking the door and destroying the phone. Tyler was next for filming instead of helping, and 2 others who helped block the door were also facing significant consequences. She said if I stayed composed and didn't do anything to compromise the case, she thought we could get meaningful probation terms and community service, maybe even some jail time for Derek since he was 17. But she kept warning me that any public statements or social media posts could give their lawyers ammunition to paint me as vindictive. I borrowed Christopher's laptop and started filing public records requests for the district's emergency response training logs and any previous incident reports about medical emergencies in classrooms. The forms were complicated, but I wanted to see if there was a pattern. If the district had been negligent in training staff and students about medical emergencies. Something about how quickly the administration moved to contain this felt wrong, like they dealt with covering things up before. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a message from a student I barely remembered, some quiet kid who sat in the back of my 3rd period class. She'd sent me screenshots from Derek's Instagram from weeks before my stroke. Posts where he was bragging about making teachers quit, about owning the classroom, about how nobody could control him. One post from 3 weeks before my stroke said he was going to make me crack next, that I was too soft and needed to learn my place. This wasn't just kids being cruel in the moment. This was planned intimidation that almost killed me. During my therapy session that week, Zora sat taking notes while I talked about my revenge fantasies, about dreams where I was crawling across that classroom floor again. But this time I caught Derek and made him feel what I felt. She wrote constantly while I talked, her clinical observations filling pages about trauma responses and processing mechanisms. She never judged, but I could tell from her notes that I was more messed up than I'd admitted to anyone else. Week 5 arrived, and Isla came to meet me in person at the hospital, sitting in the visitor's chair with a thick file of papers. She explained that all the parents had hired expensive lawyers, the kind who specialized in juvenile defense and getting charges reduced or dismissed. They were building a defense that their kids were just responding to unusual behavior, that they couldn't have known it was a medical emergency, that teenagers don't have the judgment to recognize stroke symptoms. She showed me their filing, claiming the kids were traumatized by witnessing the event and needed counseling, not punishment. Ralph showed up the next day with an HR representative, both of them wearing fake concerned faces while pushing papers at me. They wanted me to sign a non-disparagement agreement in exchange for full pay through the rest of the school year, making it clear this was their generous offer to help me recover. I read through the terms and saw it would prevent me from talking about the incident publicly, from filing any civil suits, from basically doing anything except disappearing quietly. I pushed the papers back and signed, knowing that silence would help them way more than it would help me. Later that week, the HR department sent their official incident summary to my email, and reading it made my hands shake so bad I nearly dropped my phone. They called it classroom management challenges during a medical event, and described the students' behavior as inappropriate responses to an unexpected situation, without mentioning the blocked door, the destroyed phone, or that they almost killed me. The whole thing was sanitized to protect the district from liability, making it sound like some minor disruption instead of attempted murder by negligence. That night at 2 a.m., I sat at my computer with all 7 kids' full names typed into a Facebook post, along with screenshots of the security footage showing them blocking the door and destroying my phone. You bet. My finger hovered over the post button for what felt like forever, while my good hand shook from the meds and anger mixing together. The cursor blinked at me like it was daring me to do it, to let everyone know exactly who almost killed me for laughs. My phone buzzed with a text from Christopher telling me he'd heard from another teacher that parents were already talking about suing me for trauma their kids suffered from watching my stroke. He reminded me that one wrong move on social media could destroy our whole case and give their lawyers everything they needed to paint me as vengeful and unstable. I deleted the post and closed my laptop, but stayed awake the rest of the night thinking about Derek's foot on my hand while I was dying. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived from the district with the emergency training logs I'd requested weeks earlier. Half the pages were blacked out with redaction markers, and the parts one could read showed massive gaps in the required safety protocols going back 5 years. There were supposed to be monthly fire drills, but the logs showed maybe 3 per year actually happened. Emergency response training for staff was listed as pending for 2 straight years with no follow-up. The pattern was clear as day, but proving the district knew about these failures and ignored them would take more digging. My phone pinged with an anonymous email containing screenshots from a private Facebook group called Supporting Our Kids Through False Accusations, where parents were sharing strategies to discredit me. One mom wrote that I probably faked the whole thing for attention and disability payments. Another suggested they should demand my full medical history to prove I was mentally unstable before the incident. They were pooling money for a PR firm to control the narrative and make their kids look like victims of an adult's manipulation. I spent the next week drafting a civil complaint against the district with every detail about their negligence and failure to train students on emergency response. Christopher called me before I could file it and explained that the union was already preparing their own action, focused on workplace safety violations. If I filed separately, it could create conflicts that would weaken both cases and give the district room to play us against each other. He said I needed to pick my battles and work within the system, even though the system had almost let me die. Dr. Curry noticed my blood pressure spiking during my checkup and made me wear a heart monitor for a week to track my stress levels. The results showed dangerous patterns whenever I worked on the case or thought about those kids laughing while I crawled. He prescribed an even stricter routine with no screen time after 8 p.m. and mandatory meditation sessions that felt like punishment for being angry about almost dying. Every time I deviated from his schedule, he warned that I was increasing my stroke risk by 20%. I felt trapped in a medical prison where my own body was holding me hostage. I rewrote my victim impact statement for the 5th time, trying to make it less emotional and more factual, because Isla said the defense would use any sign of anger to claim I was out for revenge instead of justice. Every word had to be perfect to avoid giving their expensive lawyers ammunition to tear me apart on the stand. I cut out the parts about nightmares and panic attacks and focused on the physical damage and ongoing medical costs. The statement went from 3 pages of raw truth to 1 page of clinical facts that barely scratched the surface of what they did to me. Isla called to tell me the defense lawyers were pushing for restorative justice instead of prosecution, which meant sitting in a circle with the kids and their parents, talking about our feelings and finding healing together. I told her there was no way I was sitting across from kids who laughed while I was dying and pretending to work toward forgiveness. She said it might be our only option if the juvenile court decided prosecution was too harsh for first-time offenders who claimed they didn't understand the situation. The thought of Eric getting to apologize and walk away made me slam my fist on the table, so hard my bad hand went numb for an hour. I filed more records requests for fire drill compliance audits, and discovered the school had ignored required alarm tests for 3 straight years with no consequences from the district. The fire marshal's office had sent multiple warnings about evacuation protocol violations, but nothing ever changed. This wasn't just about untrained kids anymore, but systematic negligence that created the perfect conditions for my near-death experience. Luke Armstrong, an education reporter for the local paper, reached out after hearing about safety concerns at the school from other teachers who were afraid to go on record. I spent 2 hours on the phone with him sharing documentation about the pattern of ignored safety requirements without naming any students to avoid legal problems. He said he was building a larger investigation into district-wide safety failures, and my case was the worst example he'd found. Ralph called me the next morning offering paid medical leave through the end of the school year if I signed a non-disclosure agreement about the incident and dropped all claims against the district. The offer came with a veiled threat that fighting them would drain my savings and destroy my career in education. I countered with demands for transparent safety reforms, including mandatory emergency response training for all students and monthly compliance audits that would be publicly reported. I told him either they fixed the broken system that almost killed me, or I would file the civil suit and let the media tear them apart with the evidence I'd collected. 3 days later, I was back in Zora's office for my weekly session, and she could tell something was different. I'd been staying up past 2 o'clock in the morning researching legal cases against school districts, and she noticed the bags under my eyes right away. She asked me to walk her through my week, and I showed her my notebook filled with pages of revenge scenarios I'd been writing down. Some were legal strategies, but others were darker fantasies about making those kids suffer the way they made me suffer. She closed the notebook and looked at me with that calm therapist face that meant she was about to say something I didn't want to hear. "These revenge fantasies are consuming your recovery," she said. We spent the next hour working through why I couldn't let go of the anger, and she made me agree to a new rule. I couldn't do any legal research or planning after 10 p.m. when I was most vulnerable to spiraling into dark thoughts. The next morning, a certified letter arrived from the district's legal department, and my hands shook as I opened it. It was a deposition notice requiring them to produce all their safety training documentation from the past 5 years. Christopher had warned me this would happen once we pushed back on their settlement offer, and now the legal machinery was finally turning in my favor. I spent the afternoon organizing my own documentation into binders while my wife watched nervously from the doorway. She kept asking if all this stress was worth it, but I couldn't stop now that we were finally getting somewhere. 2 days later, I was leaving the hospital after a follow-up appointment when someone called my name in the parking lot. I turned around to see a woman in expensive clothes walking toward me, and it took me a second to recognize her as Derek's mother. "You need to stop this," she said, getting right in my face. "They're just kids and you're ruining their futures over a misunderstanding." My hands started shaking and I could feel my blood pressure spiking as she kept talking about how Derek was suffering and couldn't sleep at night. I wanted to scream at her about how I almost died while her son laughed, but I managed to turn around and walk to my car without saying a word. She followed me all the way to my car yelling about lawsuits and how I was destroying innocent children. But I just got in and drove away with my heart pounding so hard I had to pull over 2 blocks away to catch my breath. The school board meeting in week 11 was packed with angry parents, and I could feel the tension the moment I walked in. I'd prepared a calm presentation about the safety failures that led to my stroke, but I barely got 3 sentences out before parents started shouting, "You're destroying these children's lives." One mother screamed while others accused me of wanting money and attention. I kept my voice steady and continued reading my statement about the blocked doors and destroyed phone, but the room felt ready to explode. The board members just sat there looking uncomfortable, while parents kept interrupting with accusations that I was exaggerating or lying about what happened. When I mentioned the fire drill violations, several parents laughed and said I was grasping at straws to justify ruining kids' futures. I finished my statement and sat down while the shouting continued around me, but at least I'd gotten it on the official record. 3 days later, Luke's article came out in the morning paper with the headline, "District failed safety audits for years before teacher's stroke." He didn't name any students, but the investigation showed systematic violations across every school in the district with multiple warnings that were ignored. The article included quotes from other teachers who were afraid to go on record, but confirmed that emergency protocols were never followed. My phone started ringing immediately with calls from other media outlets wanting interviews, but Christopher told me to stay quiet and let the article do its work. Ralph called me that afternoon sounding panicked and asking if we could meet to discuss moving forward constructively, which I knew meant he was feeling the pressure. Isla called the next morning to tell me the media attention was giving us leverage for stricter probation terms. The district wanted this resolved before more investigations started digging into their other problems, and the parents' lawyers were suddenly more willing to negotiate. She said we could push for meaningful consequences now instead of the slap on the wrist they'd been trying to get away with. I was reviewing the new terms she'd sent over when I felt a familiar tingling in my left arm. My vision started getting blurry, and I immediately thought I was having another stroke. I called 911 and got to the ER where they ran every test imaginable over the next 6 hours. The doctor finally came in and explained it was a transient ischemic attack, TIA, basically a warning stroke caused by stress. He said my obsession with revenge was literally killing me, and if I didn't find a way to manage the stress, I'd have a real stroke within weeks. Zora came to see me in the hospital the next day, and we had our most intense session yet. She helped me see that what I called revenge was really about setting boundaries and demanding real consequences for what happened. We worked on channeling my anger into pushing for systematic changes that would protect other teachers instead of just trying to destroy the kids who hurt me. She made me write down specific goals that were about prevention and safety rather than punishment and suffering. 2 days later, Ralph's deposition transcript arrived, and it was better than I'd hoped. Under oath, he admitted they hadn't conducted proper fire drills in 2 years, and that multiple safety warnings had been ignored due to budget concerns. This negligence evidence was exactly what we needed for both the criminal case and any civil proceedings. Christopher called it a gift and said, "We now had serious leverage to demand real changes." I met with Isla that afternoon to propose adding requirements to any plea deal the kids accepted. Instead of just probation, I wanted them to do a restorative conference where they'd have to face what they did, plus fund stroke awareness programs in schools. She said it was ambitious but might work if we framed it as rehabilitation instead of punishment. The defense parents called an emergency meeting that same week, and Isla was right about them being scared of bad press, since 3 local news stations had picked up Luke's story. She told me they were suddenly open to education programs instead of jail time, because having their kids in orange jumpsuits on the evening news would destroy their country club reputations. Christopher called me the next morning from his office and said the union would support my continued involvement, as long as I followed every piece of legal advice, and never mentioned any student names in public statements or interviews. He explained that the safety reforms I was pushing would help protect every teacher in the district, so they saw real value in keeping me engaged with the process. We spent the next 3 days at Isla's conference room drafting ground rules for the restorative justice sessions, and I made it clear there would be no fake apologies or empty words allowed. The rules stated that students had to make specific commitments to action, like community service hours and funding for safety programs. And I wouldn't sit there pretending to forgive what couldn't be forgiven. During discovery prep a week later, Isla's assistant found something that made my blood boil when she pulled records showing Derek and 4 others had mocked a substitute teacher named Mrs. Vasquez, who had a panic attack in class 6 months before my stroke. The incident report showed she begged for her inhaler while they laughed and filmed her gasping for air. But the administration just gave them detention and never told parents what really happened. This pattern of cruelty that escalated to my near death was right there in black and white, proving the school enabled these kids by doing nothing meaningful the first time. I drove straight to Ralph's office without an appointment and his secretary tried to stop me, but I walked right past her into his office where he was eating lunch at his desk. Implement real safety reforms right now, or I file a civil suit publicly with every document showing you ignored Mrs. Vasquez's assault, I said while he choked on his sandwich. His face went white as he realized the media would destroy him if they found out about the pattern of ignored medical emergencies. And within an hour he was on the phone with the district lawyers asking how fast they could draft new policies. The district's emergency board meeting happened 2 days later, and they approved mandatory medical emergency training for all staff, plus monthly fire alarm compliance checks that would be publicly reported. It wasn't nearly enough, but at least future teachers would have some protection from what I went through. Week 16 finally arrived and I walked into the first restorative conference feeling my hand shake as I saw Derek, Sarah, Mike, Tyler, and 3 others sitting with their parents around a big table. The facilitator explained the ground rules, but 20 minutes in, Mike made a joke about the whole thing being blown out of proportion. I stood up so fast my chair fell backward. A joke. I almost died while you laughed, I said before the facilitator reminded everyone about respecting the process. I sat back down and pulled out my typed statement, refusing to look at any of them while I read about the permanent damage to my left side and the daily medications I'd need forever. My voice stayed steady as I demanded specific amends, including 200 hours of community service in stroke units where they'd see real victims, funding for stroke awareness programs in every district school, and monthly progress reports to the court. Derek kept his eyes on the table the whole time while his mother, Nikki, kept trying to interrupt with excuses about peer pressure and teenage brains not being fully developed. The facilitator had to stop her 4 times and remind her that victims speak without interruption during their designated time, and she could respond only during the family portion. Sarah's parents looked sick when I described crawling across the floor while their daughter mocked my drool, and her father actually wrote notes about the community service requirements without being asked. Tyler's mom started crying when I explained how his TikTok filming meant I couldn't even suffer in private, and she whispered something harsh to him that made him flinch. After 3 hours of back and forth with their lawyers trying to reduce the service hours and funding amounts, we finally reached an agreement that felt like something, even if it wasn't real justice. The students would accept 2 years of probation with weekly check-ins, complete 200 hours of community service specifically in medical facilities, and their families would fund stroke awareness programs in schools totaling $50,000, split between them. The judge would have to approve it, but Isla felt confident it would go through since the alternative was potential juvenile detention that nobody really wanted. I left that room exhausted, but knowing I'd forced them to face real consequences, even if Derek never once looked me in the eye or said a single word of apology. 2 days later, Isla sent me the final plea memo, and I read through every word 3 times, checking that nothing got watered down. The social media bans were ironclad. Any posts about me or the incident would violate their probation instantly. The supervised reentry conditions meant they couldn't just walk back into school like nothing happened. They'd have weekly check-ins with administrators, and any disruption would trigger adult prosecution. I forwarded it to Christopher, who confirmed it was stronger than he expected. Then I waited for week 18 to arrive. The courthouse was packed when I walked in, parents filling every bench while the 7 students sat at the defense table, looking smaller than they ever did in my classroom. The judge read through each condition slowly, making sure everyone understood that this wasn't some slap on the wrist. Derek's face went pale when she explained that any violation would mean immediate transfer to adult court. No second chances, no excuses. His mom grabbed his arm when the judge asked if he understood, and he nodded without making a sound. Sarah kept looking at her phone until the bailiff took it away. Tyler's parents sat rigid while the judge detailed the community service requirements at stroke rehabilitation centers, where they'd see real victims struggling to walk and talk again. The whole hearing took 2 hours, and when it ended, not one of them looked relieved, even though they avoided detention. 3 days after that, the civil mediation wrapped up with Ralph signing papers that made my hands shake with something between relief and exhaustion. The district agreed to implement mandatory monthly fire drills with public reporting, emergency medical training for all staff within 60 days, and clear protocols for medical emergencies posted in every classroom. The settlement money would fund stroke awareness programs across the district. But watching Ralph's face as he signed those liability admissions mattered more than any check. He knew this failure would follow the district forever. Week 19 arrived and I drove to campus for my first half-day back. My left hand still weak on the steering wheel. Walking through those doors felt like entering a crime scene. But then I saw the new emergency protocols posted next to every fire alarm. Bright red signs explaining exactly what to do if someone showed medical distress. The monthly fire drill happened right on schedule at 10:30. And watching everyone evacuate properly without jokes or resistance made my chest tight with something I couldn't name. The stroke awareness program launched the next Monday with an assembly I helped design. And seeing Tyler actually assembling emergency response kits instead of filming everything for social media felt like watching a different person. He kept his head down, organizing supplies while stroke survivors explained their symptoms to students who actually took notes. This time, Sarah distributed pamphlets about recognizing stroke signs without her usual eye-rolling performance, though she still wouldn't look at me directly. Mike helped set up the projection screen showing brain scans, the same kind Dr. Curry showed me in the hospital, and his hand shook slightly when the presenter explained how close I came to death. That Thursday, I sat across from Zora in her office while she reviewed her notes from our sessions. She pointed out that my revenge fantasies had shifted from wanting them hurt to wanting systemic change. Though my sleep was still broken by dreams where I'm crawling across that classroom floor. Progress wasn't linear, she reminded me. Healing happened in waves and setbacks were normal after trauma this severe. She prescribed a new medication to help with the nightmares and scheduled me for twice-weekly sessions to work through the anger that still burned in my chest. The second restorative conference happened 2 weeks later. And this time Derek actually contributed something useful, suggesting ways to make the stroke awareness presentations more engaging for students. He still wouldn't apologize or admit real fault. But when the stroke survivor in a wheelchair described losing half her vision permanently, I saw something crack in his face. His mom noticed it too, her hand moving to his shoulder while he stared at the table. The other students started sharing ideas about prevention and education. And even though it felt hollow without genuine remorse, at least they were doing something constructive. After the session ended, I told Isla I wouldn't push for extended expulsions beyond the current terms. Keeping them under constant monitoring mattered more than adding months to their punishment, and the weekly check-ins meant any slip would have immediate consequences. She agreed it was strategic, noting that the compliance reports showed they were all meeting requirements without violations so far. Ralph called me that afternoon, asking if I'd help design the new mandatory staff training on medical emergencies. Working on prevention felt better than dwelling on what already happened, so I agreed to meet with the curriculum team next week. We spent 3 days building a program that covered strokes, seizures, severe allergic reactions, and cardiac events with clear action steps that even substitute teachers could follow. The training would roll out district-wide with quarterly refreshers, and Ralph made it clear that attendance was mandatory with no exceptions. On Friday, I asked Derek to stay after the restorative session ended. We sat alone in that conference room while I explained that I didn't need his apology because force words meant nothing. What I needed was his complete compliance with every probation term and absolute silence about me online or anywhere else. He nodded slowly, understanding that this was his only path forward that didn't end in adult prosecution. His voice stayed flat when he agreed, but his hands were clenched so tight his knuckles went white. The conference room door clicked shut behind him, and I sat there for another minute before gathering my papers and heading out to my car. 6 months had passed since the stroke when I walked into Dr. Curry's office for my follow-up appointment. He ran me through the usual tests, having me squeeze his fingers with both hands, track a pen with my eyes, walk heel to toe across the exam room. The left side of my body responded, but everything took more effort, more concentration than before. He pulled up my brain scans on his computer screen and pointed to areas where the tissue had been permanently damaged. The left arm would always be weaker, the left leg would always drag slightly when I got tired, and my left peripheral vision had a permanent blind spot. He wrote prescriptions for continued physical therapy and occupational therapy, explaining that while I'd made remarkable progress, these deficits were mine to manage forever. I nodded and took the papers, watching my left hand shake slightly as I reached for them. That afternoon, a producer from a national news show called me, wanting to do a big exposé on the whole incident with dramatic reenactments and interviews. I told her no thanks and hung up. But when the education editor from our local paper emailed asking if I'd write an op-ed about emergency response training in schools, I opened my laptop and started typing. Facts mattered more than drama, and systemic change mattered more than my personal story. I spent 3 days writing and rewriting 2,000 words about fire drill compliance, medical emergency protocols, and the need for mandatory staff training. The editor ran it on the front page of the Sunday Opinions section with statistics about stroke survival rates and response times. Christopher called me the next morning and asked me to meet him at his union office downtown. He had a thick folder on his desk with copies of every document we'd filed, every email we'd sent, every compliance report we'd received. He went through each one, showing me how our documentation had forced real changes in district policy. The new emergency protocols were in place. The training programs were funded and scheduled. The monitoring systems were active and transparent. But he warned me that systems only stay reformed when someone keeps watching them. Bureaucracies naturally slide back toward negligence without constant pressure. He handed me a checklist of things to monitor going forward, and reminded me that vigilance was a permanent requirement. The first district-wide assembly on recognizing stroke symptoms happened the following week at my old school. I sat in the back row of the auditorium watching 900 students file in for the mandatory presentation. A paramedic demonstrated the FAST test for stroke recognition, while a stroke survivor in a wheelchair described her own experience. Students who'd laughed at me 6 months ago were taking notes on the handouts, writing down the warning signs and emergency numbers. Sarah kept her head down the whole time, scribbling in her notebook without looking up at the stage. Mike sat 3 rows ahead of me, and I could see his shoulders tense when the presenter described how every minute without treatment meant more brain cells dying. The assembly ended with students practicing the FAST test on each other, and even the kids who usually goofed off during assemblies were participating. 2 days later, the district's new safety dashboard went live on their website showing real-time compliance metrics for every school. Fire drill completion rates, emergency training attendance, response time averages, all updated monthly with green, yellow, and red indicators. Parents could log in and see exactly how their kid's school was performing on safety measures. The superintendent sent out a press release about transparency and accountability. Though Ralph had fought against the public dashboard until the school board overruled him, making the data public meant no more sweeping failures under the rug or claiming everything was fine when inspections were being skipped. Isla called me that Thursday with an update on the sentenced students' probation compliance. She'd pulled the reports from juvenile services showing Derek, Tyler, Mike, Sarah, and the others were all meeting their requirements without any violations. They were showing up for their community service hours at the Stroke Rehabilitation Center, attending their mandatory counseling sessions, staying off social media as ordered. The monitoring system was working exactly as designed with weekly check-ins and immediate consequences for any slip-ups. She said the judge was pleased with the structure we'd insisted on instead of just standard probation. That weekend, I was loading groceries into my car when someone tapped my shoulder. Nikki Barnes, Derek's mother, stood there looking uncomfortable, her car keys clutched in her hand. She spoke quietly, thanking me for pushing for action-based consequences instead of just punishment for Derek. Her son needed accountability and structure, not just anger and revenge. And the probation requirements were actually helping him understand what he'd done. She walked away before I could respond, but I saw her wipe her eyes as she got into her car. Later that night, I sat at my computer and started typing up my story in simple, clear language. I wrote about the stroke, the countdown, the crawling, the fire alarm, the recovery, the legal process, the systemic changes. I acknowledged that my left side would never fully recover, that I'd carry these deficits forever. But I wasn't just a victim anymore. Those kids who almost killed me for laughs had turned me into an advocate for change. And because I survived, hundreds of students would be safer in their classrooms. I hit post and watched the upvotes start climbing immediately. My journey from helplessness to a powerful force for change was finally out there.